Hello everyone, welcome to Fairly Based. I'm your host Henry, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how I paint the larger Tyranids in my version of the Coconut Crab color scheme. I'm going to be using a Screamer Killer today, but the concepts here apply to any larger Tyranid. I'm able to get great results in almost no time, so without further ado, please like and subscribe, and let's get into the video. The first thing I start with is priming using Wraithbone. I used the GW spray because I had it on hand, but you can use other paints, which I'll talk about in a second. After everything is all primed, I use Leviathan blue contrast paint, which I put into a dropper bottle, to block out all the claws, teeth, and hooves. Anything that is like a nail or tooth gets this treatment. You can do just one coat of this paint to get some variance, but it's already so opaque that I do a second coat in any lighter spots just to get solid coverage. Mission failed successfully, Games Workshop. Once I have everything base coated, I pull out my airbrush and mix up some Army Painter Royal Cloak and thinner. I spray the last third to half of all the blue areas to make a nice gradient. The only area here that I neglect to hit is the teeth. I'm not exactly sure why, but I like the look of the Tyranids without the teeth highlighted. This does come down to personal preference, but if you do decide to do them, then it's probably worth doing that by hand. And now, it's time for every airbrush user's favorite part, cleaning out the airbrush. This is absolutely essential to do every single time you use it, but in my experience, this almost always dwarfs the time spent actually using the airbrush to paint. After that, I come in with some golden high flow acrylics Titan buff and touch up any areas I've oversprayed. If you didn't see my last videos, the general idea of this paint is that it's airbrush ready. It's not actually made for miniatures, but it is a near color match for Wraithbone. It's cheaper, easier to handle, and has absolutely no problems with chalkiness. After that, I take some Army Painter tanned flesh and draw a rough line on each side of the carapace. What I do is kind of mentally divide each side of each carapace plate into quarters, and then fill in that second to outer quarter. This is not an exact science, just follow your gut and it should look great. A lot of people will recommend painting borders for each colors and then filling them in after. In fact, Catgut Painting, who pioneered the basic Coconut Crab scheme, recommends this. My version of the scheme puts an emphasis on simplicity, and I found that it takes half the time to just do it all in one sweep. Make sure to hit every carapace piece across the model with these lines. After that is where my larger models differ from my smaller ones that I painted in the last couple videos. I take Army Painter Abomination Gore and fill in the inner two quarters to make a sort of thicker line down the center of each plate. The three-color pattern looked fine on the larger models, but I found myself wanting a little more interest on the model. I had seen many versions of the Coconut Crab scheme that used different colors, but none that incorporated an extra one. The red scratched that itch. I feel like it's worth mentioning that you don't have to use any of these exact colors. I am using Army Painter War Paints because it's what I have, but I know that they are phasing them out in favor of their new Fanatic War Paints, and a lot of you will be using different brands of paint anyways. You can use any colors of close approximation and it should look great. No, you do not have to worry about painting the tops of the stacks on the carapace plates in the back. We'll get to those in a minute. To lay in our fourth color, I used a dark brown to fill in the space between the Abomination Gore and the tanned flesh. My preferred mix is 2 parts dirt spatter to 1 part grim black speed paint. You can lay in this color before the red, but I found that if you have any overlap, it's much easier to go over the other colors with this than to go over the brown with the other colors. That's actually generally good advice for miniature painting as a whole. You should almost always go from darker to lighter and layer your lighter colors on top of the darker ones, as your darker colors tend to have a lot better coverage. Originally, I had planned to put in a section talking about how this scheme is really beginner friendly and you can always go back and paint any parts you miss. But, as I was painting, I noticed that I made this exact mistake. I somehow missed the carapace plates on the most iconic part of the model, the arms. So I went back and painted them, and they looked much better. It's absolutely okay to make a mistake like this. I myself have painted up a decently sized Tyranid force, including another Screamer Killer, and somehow I still forgot about that. Don't beat yourself up over a mistake that everyone will make. Once that's all base coated, I pull back out my tanned flesh and begin putting dots along the border between that and the Wraithbone color. I put these all along the border with roughly a dot's width between dots and off the line going into the Wraithbone. They should get less frequent the farther out you go. I just load my brush with a moderate amount of paint and then press lightly to the model to leave a bead of paint. You can press lighter or harder to control the size of the dot. You can also just use a smaller or larger brush. After that, do exactly the same thing but going into the dark brown areas. To do these dots, I thin my paints to consistency where they flow well, but most importantly cover in one coat. If you have to do 2 thin coats on each dot, you'll probably die of old age first. One thing I've noticed is that when you leave a larger bead of paint, capillary action can sometimes pull 2 nearby dots together. Make sure not to let this happen too much or it can muddle up that whole area. Then we skip over the brown again to the red areas and place dots going into the brown. If you go with this exact pattern on a smaller model, your brown might seem like it's starting to disappear, but don't worry, we'll fix that. In my experience, this red almost looks very muted, so if you're using this exact paint, then don't worry about being too precise with these dots. Any dots that are a little misshapen or not quite placed properly won't stand out against the more vibrant colors. Then I took my Titan buff and did dots going back into the tanned flesh. You really can do this at any point in the dotting process, and I'm honestly not sure why I did this now, but the step doesn't have to happen in any particular order. I actually like to do this first on smaller models, and you might find the same on larger ones as well. It all comes down to personal preference. I really don't think it matters too much. This scheme has a lot of specific steps that you'll have to follow in a specific order to get the effect, but this is not one of them. Finally, I do the brown dots. I take my same mix from before and place dots going into the tanned flesh. You'll notice that there are also my lightest colored dots here, so that's why I only go roughly halfway into the color with my Titan buff. This comes down to personal preference, but I like the cleaner look it gives to the model when the 2 colors coming in don't overlap. I have seen a lot of models painted in this color scheme where they do mix quite a bit, and if pulled off right, it will look nice. This might be just about the 50th time I've said it all comes down to personal preference in this video alone, but they are your models, and you don't have to stick with what I say. If my advice has done nothing more than help you out and give you inspiration, then this video has fulfilled its purpose. I take my brown dots and place them going into the red as well, but this time I make sure to leave more red exposed towards the centers. Don't forget to paint the tower-like protrusions on the back. This is one area that I've found is particularly easy to miss. Once I'm happy with all the dots and everything, I take a minute to touch up any parts of the model I found lacking. A bit of accidentally placed paint here and some over-enthusiastic dots there, as well as some major red touch-ups because for some reason my clumsy self rubbed paint off in some of the exposed areas. If you have any semblance of gentleness when painting, then you shouldn't have this problem. Once everything is exactly how I want it, I take some Games Workshop Seraphim Sepia and thin it with some water. I just slap this on the entire model, excluding any blue areas. This step pulls together all of the colors, making a nice orange and red, a darker brown, and bringing definition to all the bony recesses of the body. If you're having to think hard about this step, then you're probably doing it wrong. Just slap it on the model and watch for any excessive pooling, and you should be good to go. This process of washing is one of the things that's going to start getting our Screamer Killer towards looking like that more finished product, and we're nearing one of the longest steps in the process, which is actually letting the wash dry. Once everything is good to go, I take some Army Painter Red Tone and put it into all the fleshy vents and tears in the body. I talked about some alternatives to Red Tone in my last 2 videos, so I won't go over those here. Anywhere it looks like the skin might be thinner, like around the joints, gets a thinned coat of this as well. If any of these vents got too filled in with the Seraphim Sepia, then you can always go back and lay down another coat of your Titan buff to bring it back up to that nice off-white before putting your red tone over that. I then come back in with the Royal Cloak and paint his weird forehead. This is another step that can happen really whenever. This is just when I like to do it. I also use this time to highlight the claws. I highlight the sharp edges and another edge on the underside of the claw, as well as these raised bumps on the top. Then I use Aethermatic Blue contrast paint over the Royal Cloak of the head to bring a more interesting color. Then I grab some Army Painter Pure Red and start placing dots of this highlight color within the darker red areas. I focus on the central parts and I make sure not to go into the brown. You don't have to do this at all if you want a more subdued look to the carapace, but I find that it helps bring a bit of pop. I also use a detail brush to highlight these bumps on the head. Then I take some very lightly thinned red tone and put it into the front area of the head to make a more natural transition between the carapace and the brain. Following that, I take some Army Painter Dark Tone and put this into all the recesses where armor plates overlap. This is my favorite part of painting the model because it goes super quick and just takes it to the next level. Arguably one of the most important characteristics of a well-painted model is its readability. I think we often underestimate just how small and detailed Warhammer models are, and it doesn't matter how technically well they're painted if you have no clue what's going on from across the table. This dark tone is essentially the Tyranid version of panel lining, like you see on larger tanks and Space Marine-like figures. We're doing exactly the opposite of edge highlighting. We're darkening all the recesses, but it has the same effect. It makes it easier for our eyes to pick out each individual panel. Following suit, I take some Titan buff and place highlights all over the raised areas of the body. Don't overthink this. It might not be an area light would naturally highlight, but this paint scheme would be so incredibly difficult to paint respecting light that we're already ignoring this. The unwashed color puts a subtle highlight to the darker tan and really brings out all the raised details. I then took some Volupus Pink contrast paint and filled in this fleshy area behind the head, as well as the mouth and tongue area. We're nearing done, so stay with me. I grabbed some Grim Black speed paint and fill in the eyes, as well as the pockets on the top of the towers. I used Royal Cloak to paint the rims, as well as highlight the circles on the head. I made sure I was happy with how everything turned out before slapping on some varnish. Glue this guy to a base and you have a pretty nice looking Screamer Killer. It was super easy and fun to paint, and pretty quick too. Even I, who paints at the rate GW refreshes fine cast character models, was able to get this done comfortably in an afternoon. This is actually the second Screamer I've painted up, and I can't wait to get these guys on the table shredding enemies. If you're looking to see how I painted other models in this color scheme, I already have a couple videos up, and more are on the way. If you got anything out of these tutorials, I would appreciate if you hit the like and subscribe buttons, and the notification bell if you really want to make my day. I have big plans for this channel, but it's only possible with your help. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.